Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we are absolutely pulling back the curtain on the exact roadmap the top 1% use to manage, protect, and build wealth from scratch. Look, wealth generation isn't about luck, and it's certainly not magic. It is an incredibly predictable, mechanical process. We're going to start by deconstructing your own personal financial blueprint to understand how capital actually flows. And then we're going to bridge a really fascinating gap, revealing exactly what happens when these same ruthless financial strategies are scaled up and deployed by massive corporate machines on a global level. You don't need a finance degree to master this stuff, I promise. You just need to understand the underlying mechanics. So let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Before you can even think about building wealth, you have to get brutally honest about your baseline. Now, most people try to audit their finances by tracking their money month to month. But you know what? Operating on a 30-day cycle is actually a massive trap. Think about it. A monthly lens completely misses those irregular property taxes, the sudden huge vehicle repairs, or those annual vacations. It creates a total false sense of security. To establish true financial clarity, you have to zoom out. You need to track your total net income per year against your total expenses per year. This annual snapshot strips away all the daily noise and forces you to confront a really uncomfortable but definitive question. Are you actively bleeding wealth, or are you strategically buying your freedom?
The reality of that annual audit really just comes down to a simple binary. If your yearly calculation reveals a negative surplus, well, you're actively bleeding wealth. That means your lifestyle demands are entirely outpacing your leverage. Basically, you're working for your money, rather than your money working for you. A positive yearly surplus, on the other hand, is your absolute best weapon. The fundamental principle to internalize here is that your income, it only dictates your current lifestyle. Your net worth, which is just the gap between what you own and what you owe, is the actual engine that buys back your time, your autonomy, and your future freedom.
To protect that positive surplus, you absolutely have to neutralize bad debt. I'm talking specifically about high-interest consumer debt that just drains your future capital. Now, personal finance is about 20% head knowledge and 80% behavior. The debt avalanche strategy appeals strictly to the spreadsheet, right? You attack the highest interest rate first to mathematically save the maximum amount of money over time. But let's be real, humans aren't spreadsheets. The debt snowball strategy recognizes that we are driven by dopamine. By attacking the smallest balance first, completely ignoring the interest rate, you secure a quick, undeniable win. And honestly, that psychological momentum is very often the exact behavioral hack you need to sustain the grueling marathon of total debt elimination.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that it debunks a massive misconception. People think budgeting is this awful form of financial restriction. In reality, a proper framework is simply intentional resource allocation. Enter the 50-30-20 rule. 50% of your income covers absolute survival needs, housing, basic groceries, utilities. 30% is freely deployed for your wants, the dinners out, the travel, the fun experiences. And that final 20% is exclusively reserved for the future you, channeled entirely into savings, investments, and debt reduction. Listen, if your baseline needs are devouring 70 or 80% of your income, you don't just need a budget. You need a ruthless audit of your fixed costs. Renegotiate your insurance, cut those unused subscriptions, and literally force your expenses back into alignment.
Once you finally secure that surplus, the very next question is where to store it. And traditional banking is largely an illusion built entirely against your favor. When you deposit cash into a standard checking account, the bank doesn't just neatly lock it in a vault for safekeeping. No way. They immediately turn around and lend your money out to other people for mortgages or business loans at 6 to 7% interest. And in return for using your hard-earned capital, they pay you a miserable fraction of 1%. This hidden gap is called the net interest margin. It is exactly how banks pocket billions in profit using your liquidity. You have to stop leaving free margin on the table. Moving your emergency fund into a high-yield account forces the bank to actually pass a fair share of those interest yields right back to you.
So, the crucial point is understanding exactly when to transition your surplus from saving to investing, and that requires strict chronological discipline. Step 1 is establishing a preliminary breathing room fund equal to exactly 1 month of living expenses. Step 2, halt all investments to aggressively crush any consumer debt carrying an interest rate over 8%. Now, why 8% specifically? Because historical stock market returns average around 8 to 10%. It is mathematically impossible to reliably out-invest the aggressive drain of a 20% credit card. Step 3 only begins once that toxic debt is completely dead. That's when you build out your full 3 to 6 month emergency fund while simultaneously redirecting capital into long-term wealth building.
Why is long-term market investing the ultimate wealth multiplier? Because time is literally your ultimate financial superpower. Look, in the short term, the stock market behaves a lot like a casino. It's wildly volatile and totally unpredictable. But over the span of decades, it acts as a remarkably reliable wealth-weighing machine. Over the last century of recorded data, anyone who invested in a broad S&P 500 index and held it for a minimum of 20 years has never lost money. If you simply placed $100,000 into the market and left it entirely alone for 2 decades, at an 8% historical return, compounding interest transforms it into nearly $500,000, completely passively. It's incredible.
But here's the catch. A truly resilient financial blueprint has to evolve over time. When you're in your 20s or 30s, your most valuable asset isn't actually your cash. It's your massive time horizon. That allows you to absorb heavy equity risk in exchange for aggressive growth. As you approach retirement, though, your primary directive shifts completely from wealth accumulation over to wealth preservation. You can actually calculate your own baseline risk tolerance right now in your head. Take your current age, round it to the nearest 5, and subtract 10. That resulting number? That's the percentage of your portfolio that should be anchored in incredibly safe, low-volatility bonds, leaving the rest in stocks to safely outpace inflation.
Protecting that expanding wealth means actively avoiding cultural lifestyle traps. And guys, the most devastating wealth killer for the middle class is, without a doubt, the automobile. Dealerships are highly trained to manipulate you into focusing purely on an affordable monthly payment. They intentionally mask the crushing total cost of interest over a 6 or 7-year loan. To protect your capital, adhere strictly to the 24-10 rule. You put down at least 20% in cash to avoid instant depreciation traps, you finance the vehicle for a maximum of 4 years, and your total monthly automotive costs, which includes the loan, insurance, fuel, and maintenance, must never ever exceed 10% of your gross monthly income.
And this brilliantly illustrates another deeply ingrained cultural narrative, the absolute certainty that renting a home is just throwing money away. Conventional wisdom tells us home ownership is the only valid path. But honestly, this completely ignores the silent killer of unrecoverable sunk costs. When you buy a property, your mortgage payment is simply the minimum you will pay each month. That's before property taxes, closing fees, and a punishing annual maintenance cost that averages about 1% of the home's total value. When you rent, your monthly payment is the maximum you will pay. If you plan to relocate within 5 to 7 years, renting isn't a waste at all. It's a hyper-strategic purchase of financial flexibility that keeps your down payment capital liquid and investable.
So we've established the micro-mechanics of personal wealth. Auditing your baseline, understanding those sunk costs, eliminating high-interest debt, and really maximizing your surplus. But these mechanics are universally applicable. So what happens when we zoom out? What happens when a massive corporate entity takes these exact same ruthless financial principles and applies them to the globe? To fully grasp the sheer power of these mechanics, we only need to look at the multi-billion-dollar business of the world's biggest sport and see how the exact same rules of surplus and debt govern nations, just like they govern individuals. The macroeconomics of the FIFA World Cup operate as an absolute masterclass in wealth mechanics. FIFA essentially functions as a hyper-efficient multi-billion-dollar engine. They ruthlessly hoard the revenue-generating assets. They secure the exclusive broadcasting rights, massive corporate sponsorships, and a dynamic pricing monopoly on tickets. They are maximizing their margin and flawlessly protecting their surplus. The host country, conversely, basically assumes the role of the consumer, taking on bad debt. To host the games, sovereign nations absorb massive, unrecoverable sunk costs, spending billions on temporary stadiums and infrastructure. It's the ultimate real estate trap. The corporate entity walks away with a massive wealth surplus, while the host is frequently left footing a devastating financial bill.
Whether we're analyzing a global sports monopoly extracting billions in profit, or just examining your own personal bank account, the mechanics of wealth remain fundamentally identical. It is all about understanding the raw math, ruthlessly avoiding toxic debt, managing your sunk costs, and giving time the leverage it needs to do the heavy lifting for you. True financial literacy isn't just about hoarding a giant pile of money, it is entirely about buying back your ultimate autonomy. Knowing how the machine works, the choice is ultimately yours. Will you choose clarity over chaos and finally take control of your financial autonomy today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it fundamentally transformed how you view the mechanics of wealth